This is the oldest synagogue in Europe, the Pinka Sova Synagogue in Prague.
DioGuardi, director of the Albanian American Civic League and the director of a project we're doing in our foundation on the role that Albanians played saving Jews during the Holocaust. Can you hear me well, by the way? I want to actually begin with just a very brief history of who the Albanian people are leading up to the war, because I think Betsy Anthony will be very interested to know that in America I'm constantly being asked, oh, you're speaking about Armenians, aren't you? Albanians are very invisible people in the United States, probably not so much here in this multicultural setting. Nevertheless, I want to say that Albanians are the oldest inhabitants of the Balkans. They are the Illyrians, the core pre-Hellenic population that extended as far as Greece and Italy. And this is important during the 6 centuries that Rome occupied and ruled Illyria. The Illyrians resisted assimilation, retained their legal norms, their culture, and their language. And that persists to this day, so both are distinctly different from their neighbors in Southeast Europe. Illyrians are Albanians, they use the Roman alphabet. Their neighbors are Slavs who use the Cyrillic alphabet. Albanians are Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians, along with some Jews who have lived side by side in harmony for centuries. Then, beginning in the 15th century, Albanians become occupied by the Ottoman Turks for 500 years. And no sooner do they throw off the yoke of that domination in 1912, they then incur waves of Slavic domination. And sort of the pivotal event that most people know about is the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, when 500,000 Albanians they basically died of hunger and disease. And this was then followed by a period that to some extent extends to this day of racism, imprisonment, assimilation, mass expulsion, and genocide. And right after the Balkan Wars, actually right after World War I, it was Winston Churchill, the American president, who made sure that the so-called great powers of Europe that were carving up, and Britain, that were carving up the Albanian lands, would have their own state in a place called the Republic of Albania. What did that mean, and what does it mean today? There are 3.5 million Albanians inside the state of Albania, and outside there are another 3.5 million in Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Preševo, which is in southern Serbia, and Chamria in northern Greece. Now, before I start with the story of what happened in World War II, I think I should say something about the context in which I'm speaking to you. I think it's important to explain I'm not an oral historian, first of all, as you are not. I'm self-trained in a discipline that I came to very happily out of necessity. When the Bosnian War began, I was a book publisher specializing in international politics. And those of us in America would watch our television sets every day, and we were being told, as we saw the concentration camps, the destruction of the mass destruction of Bosnian people by the Serb paramilitary and military forces of Milosevic, oh, this is not your war. This is a quagmire. We can't become involved. Well, this is a very, very wrong thing to do to a relatively privileged population. And I made the decision on the spot, no. I decided, no, this is our war. That every generation has an obligation to respond to racism and fascism, and I decided to publish a book on what was happening in the former Yugoslavia from the perspective of the anti-Milosevic, anti-war opposition. And it was in this context that I actually moved into an activist position influencing U.S. foreign policy on the Balkans. I was already involved with the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Truth to tell, by the way, the person who becomes my husband in this period is a former member of the Congress, which makes that access easier still. But I also, because of my own personal experience, became an actor in Kosovo's struggle for independence. And I know that there are many scholars who would not be comfortable with my having that position, of being both an analyst and an actor in the history that I am talking about. But I happen to agree, I know she's speaking about it in a slightly different way, but I happen to agree with Selma Leidesdorf that we need to be engaged. We have to have an engaged dialogue, and in my particular case, I would not have been able to do the kind of work I'm doing, to get the kind of oral history, testimony, or involvement that I have if I did not have that role. I would not be accepted. So I am happy about that. I'm also aware of its limitations. I've spent about 15 years in various ways working on the resolution of the Albanian dimension of the Balkan conflict. And from the beginning, it was very clear to me that the Albanian history, on the one hand, as I said before, is thousands of years of torture, arrest, imprisonment, mass expulsion, even genocide. But it's also a history of resistance and overcoming. And at the same time, it is a history of invisibility. The Albanian story was first, they could counter I saw the possibility to counter the competing narratives of their oppressors, but also to become part of the European-wide narrative, emerging both in the context of the end of fascism, but also the end of communism. And so, by the mid-1990s, I became aware that there was also a unique opportunity to begin to reveal the Albanian perspective from an Albanian point of view through the role that Albanians played during the Holocaust, which is very, very unique. We've had several wonderful presentations at this conference about Eastern European countries emerging from communism that were complicit, but in the case with the Nazis, but in the case of Albanians, every Jew who either lived in Albania or who sought asylum there was rescued. And I'm glad that my colleague Leka Rezniqi was able to join me at this conference, because we're also documenting the fact now, we're in the process of documenting the fact that any Jew who made it into Albania could only have done that with the help of Albanians who were outside, especially of the state of Albania, especially in Kosovo. We're only in the early stages of documenting the history of Albanians during the Holocaust, but I believe it's very important to correct a gap in the Holocaust literature, to fill it, but in the process to face head-on, through the voices of Albanian people from the various parts of Albanian lands, the revisionist history of Albanians by their historical oppressors, which has allowed for their continuing subjugation even on the global stage. I'll say more about that later if there's time. Now to go to the setting in World War II. May 15th, 1939, Mussolini's Italian fascist forces invaded and occupied Albania. The Italians, and so they were there up until 1943, then the German Nazis followed. They remained there until they were, of course, defeated by the Allied forces. Very few people know that from as early as 1933 until the end of World War II, in 1944, all Jews, as I said before, who lived there or who sought asylum there were saved. This information was suppressed because in 50 years, from World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, everything about the culture, history, and reality of the Albanian people was being concealed or misrepresented. On the one hand, in Albania, by an Albanian Stalinist communist dictator, Enver Hoxha, who all contacts with outsiders were forbidden. Hundreds of thousands of Albanians were murdered and imprisoned during his reign. And then we have all of the other Albanians outside the state of Albania who are subject to anti-Albanian racism and repression under communist dictator Marshal Tito. So now, only 20 years have passed since the Iron Curtain fell, since Albania was opened, since the Balkans have reasserted themselves after 500 years, basically, and tragically dominated by Serbian dictator Milosevic's 4 wars of aggression from 1989 to 1999. And for a brief period of time, by the way, during that war, the international spotlight focused on the Albanian reality. And that was when more than 12,000 were murdered and close to 1 million were driven from their homes to refugee camps in Albania and Macedonia. But not long after that war, Albanians found themselves subjugated again, and in the context of 9/11, what happened was doubly tragic because Serbia and its allies, in an effort to prevent Kosovo from becoming an independent state, and this will become important, launched a worldwide propaganda campaign to depict Albanians as a Muslim, potentially terrorist force in the heart of Europe. But it is not still widely understood, and this is an important point for what happened during the Holocaust. Albanians are a purveyor not of an Islamic idea, but of an Albanian idea. And this is what underlay their saving role. The unique role that Albanians played is part of a history, I think, that has to be captured because it is marked by a centuries-old moral code of religious tolerance and resistance to totalitarianism. There were about, when European Jewry came into Albania or escaped to Albania, there were only 200 Jews living in Albania, and I won't go into the whole history. That's been well documented of when they arrived. I know, Albanians absolutely refused to acquiesce to Nazism. I know there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure you're all aware of Bulgaria's role. And it was with the Axis powers, but of course, and I don't want to diminish the monumental achievement of Bulgaria, but the records show that even though 50,000 Jews, which is extremely important, were saved inside Bulgaria, in 1943 the government deported to the Nazi death camp in Treblinka 11,000 non-Bulgarian Jews living in Macedonia and in the former Yugoslavia and in Thrace in Greece, which they had annexed as early as about 1941. In addition, Jews inside of Bulgaria were discriminated against. Again, there's more I would go into at another point. The Albanian story is unique, and as Dr. Mordecai Paldial, who many of you may know about, the former director of the Department for the Righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, he said central to the uniqueness of the Albanian story is the fact that the persons saved were mostly not Albanian citizens, but Jews who had fled to the country when it was ruled by Italians and now found themselves in danger of being deported to Auschwitz and other death camps. And early on, Albanians hid and projected Jews on their own initiative in an uncoordinated way, and Apostle Katani and Dr. Patrick Zorba of the Albanian-Israeli Friendship Association have documented this in detail. Later, it became much more dangerous when the Germans came into Albania, and there was a more organized attempt on the part of Albanians to develop structures for saving Jews. The Albanian officials passed some anti-Jewish regulations, but it was only to placate the Italians and the Germans, and the Albanians did not. They simply did not obey. When the Gestapo ordered Albanian leaders to provide a list of all Jews residing in Albania, they stood up to the Nazis and refused. In fact, what you have that's also unique in the Albanian situation is everyone from the government to the street sweeper was engaged in the rescue. The fact that Albanians had been isolated from centuries of institutionalized anti-Semitism in Western Europe was certainly a factor in the unique role that they play. And one witness, and it's very, very important that we have this witness, happened to be the Jewish U.S. ambassador to Albania from 30 to 33, and he wrote in his letters, there is no trace of any discrimination against Jews in Albania because Albania happens to be one of the rare lands in Europe today where religious prejudice and hate do not exist, even though Albanians themselves are divided into 3 faiths. And he became instrumental, by the way, in arranging for German and Austrian Jews to settle in Albania. What was the key principle? Why was this happening? I happen to, by the way, have belatedly read Stephen Baum's book, The Psychology of Genocide, and he talks about rescuers having a very high moral standard of conduct, one that translates to strengths, allowing for what some have termed the altruistic urge. And I agree with that, and I would be interested to talk to him because he's mainly talking about individuals in situations where there was a lot of complicity, of how he might react to the Albanian situation where their history is in response to, their history in response to their own successive waves of foreign domination and persecution led them to to use a set of customary laws called the Kanun. This is what kept the Albanian people together, and underlying it is a moral code of Besa. And all aspects of one's life in the Albanian world, technically, were to be informed by this. The Kanun was transmitted orally. It was handed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. It was central to the Albanian survival. Eventually, it becomes codified. And the effort to try at every point to change the nature of Albanian reality was absolutely opposed because the Kanun, which had a belief in social honor and a primary maxim that the house of an Albanian first belongs to God and then to the guest. A weary guest, the Kanun says, must be received and surrounded with honor. The Kanun demands that a guest should be accompanied lest he be the victim of some wicked act. It goes on, you must defend your guest's honor even if your own life is in danger. And this was the operating principle. So the modern Western concept of foreigner does not exist in the Kanun, only the concept of the guest. So hence, during the Holocaust, there were, quote, no Jewish foreigners in Albania, only Jewish guests who had to be sheltered and protected, even at the risk of Albanian lives. I was fortunate to be able to interview, of course, not the rescuer, but the survivor. The story of Ali Sheker Pashkai is an amazing story and very emblematic. He was the owner of a general store in Puka, and Albanians, in 1943, a German transport carrying 19 Albanian prisoners on their way to hard labor had one Jew who was to be shot. And they were outside of Alia's store, and Alia starts sizing up the situation, and it was fortunate he happened to speak excellent German, not common at all. And he decided to invite the Nazis into the store, and he offered them food, and he purposely plied them with wine until they were drunk. While they were drinking, Alia convinced the Nazis that he should give the prisoners some food. And to the young Jewish prisoner, he handed a piece of melon, and inside of it, he had concealed the note, instructing him to flee into the woods and wait at a designated place until it was safe. When the Nazis got ready to leave Alia's establishment, they discovered the Jewish prisoner was missing. Everybody erupted in fury. There was pure chaos. They dragged Alia into the village square. They pinned him against a wall. 4 times they put a gun to his head, but he continued to maintain his innocence, that he had nothing to do with this escape. So they decide to leave. They search for the Jewish prisoner. When they return empty-handed, now they turn to Alia, who's tied up at that point, and they threaten to burn the village down if he doesn't confess. He doesn't confess. Finally, the Germans leave Puka for good. Alia retrieved the Jewish prisoner eventually. His name is Joshua Berukowitz. He hid in his home. Then he put him in his home in hiding for 2 years until the war was over. And the amazing thing is today he's a dentist living in Mexico City. And I was able to interview him when actually Leka's grandfather and I were in Yad Vashem in 2007 for the first acknowledgement of the role that Albanians played in saving Jews during the Holocaust. I think it's an amazing story. Another thing that's important is that Albanians not only risked their lives to save Jews, but up until now, no evidence has been found that anyone accepted compensation. There is a man who was named Abraham Ilyasov, but aka Abram Ghani, who offered to compensate Becher Çoça, who's now 96 years old, for sheltering him from 43 to 44. And Çoça's response was, no, absolutely not. When Albanians give, we give Besa to a friend. We never sell Besa. I want to go back to again that to the fact that while the Albanian story during the Holocaust has inspired some contemporary analysts from the perspective that the majority of Albanians are Muslim. They're, in fact, 65% are predominantly secular, 25% are Eastern Orthodox Christian, 10% are Roman Catholic. All participated in the rescue. And it was, and this is very important, some scholars right now are trying to define this, or some observers, as a Muslim act. It was an Albanian act, it was not a religious act. Every part of the population was involved, from the political elite to the rural peasantry, as I said before, based on the Code of Besa. And I was very interested when we were at Yad Vashem. Avner Shalev, chairman of the directorate, accurately described in his introduction to the recognition that the basic human value of helping one another, even at the risk of one's own life, was central. And Besa, he said, and this is also very important to me, goes much further than the culture of higher education that did not manage to stem the cruelty and brutality in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. Albanians showed, he said, what humanity can be at its finest. And his observations were underscored for me on a tour of the Holocaust History Museum afterwards, because when we went to the end, there were large displays, and you may have, those of you who were there obviously have seen this, of photographs and biographies of the creators of the final solution to exterminate European Jewry. It was hotly debated by the curators initially. Why should we be reifying, giving preeminence to the people who did this? And the conclusion ultimately was, no, we want to show that most of the mass murders were products of the European Enlightenment. Men who held doctorates from leading universities in Germany and other parts of Western Europe. The oral history, and this will be pretty much my conclusion, the oral history documenting the role that Albanians played during the Holocaust actually contains within it another unfolding history about the struggle to document and reveal this information. And this can only happen in a context where you still have a large part of Albanian lands that are, in some sense, where Albanians are second-class, even third-class citizens in parts of the Balkans. We would never have known about any of this if it were not initially for the fact that in 1990, DioGuardi, who I did not know at that time, now my husband, and the late Congressman Tom Lantos were the first U.S. officials to enter Albania in 50 years. This is 1990. Enver Hoxha is dead by that time. The last dictator, Ramiz Alia, wants to impress Tom Lantos. Tom Lantos, I don't know whether you know, was the only Holocaust survivor out of Hungary in the U.S. Congress. What does he do? He opens up an archive, and in the archive are all the documents, photographs, newspaper clippings of the Albanian rescuers inside Albania. They had been locked in a vault for 50 years. At that point, he turns them over as a gift. My husband, fortunately, had a very close friend in the right places in Israel, who then turned over these documents, and they were authenticated by Yad Vashem. That was the beginning. Today, there were about 69 Albanians who have been recognized thus far. Now, and there's also another important story. We would have liked to have had Felicita Yakuel with us, because Josip Yakuel was an Albanian Jew inside Albania who saved Jews. He and his daughter specifically led the exodus that went at the end of when Albania falls, when communism falls in Albania, which is later, of course, than the fall of the Berlin Wall. They managed to get almost all Albanians, all Jews in Albania, into Israel. One of the things that Felicita said to me, and I think this is important, she said because communist Albania had, just like all other communist regimes, and we've heard about it throughout the conference, suppressed all discussion of the Holocaust. She said she only realized after her arrival in Israel, in spite of what her own family had done, the full extent of the historic deeds of simple Albanians and Albanian authorities. She said that the Nazi killing machine had come to stop in the poorest and supposedly uncivilized country in Europe, and that Albania had done what the cultured and illuminated countries of Europe had failed to do. I think that continuing the exploration of the Albanian role in the Holocaust is critical to establishing a complete history of Eastern Europe during World War II and to restoring Albanians to their proper role within it. In the 21st century, Albanians have a lot to overcome in terms of the destructive psychological and psychosocial consequences of their hundreds of years of occupation, racism, and genocide, as epitomized by their courageous behavior during the Holocaust. The story is not only one of subjugation, however. It is one of resistance to totalitarianism, religious tolerance, and a commitment to justice in the face of violence, persecution, and war. Telling the story of the role that Albanians played in rescuing Jews from the ravages of the Holocaust is not simply a reconstruction of historical fact, but a way of reconstructing identity. The collective Albanian response to the Holocaust powerfully illustrates the intimate interconnection between Vesa, religious tolerance, and resistance to totalitarianism. Telling this story allows Albanians to define themselves after more than a century of being defined by their subjugators. It's an instrument of empowerment and the recovery of the Albanian story, previously unheard in the history of the Holocaust, reveals ethical action in the context of genocide that I believe requires a lot more exploration. Thank you very much.
Okay, and finally, following right on that, Rezniqi.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Leka, the Secretary of Kosovo-Israeli Friendship Association. I am not an historian, but I am the successor of one of the Albanians in Kosovo that rescued Jews during the Holocaust. As Shirley mentioned, there is a large part of one side of history that is not yet being discovered about the Albanians outside the Albania nation borders had on saving and sheltering Jews during the Holocaust. As in Albania, this information was available in records for half a century, but it was hidden by communist forces and the former Yugoslavia in the post-war era. In Kosovo, the suppression of this information also intersected with the center of Slavic domination over the Albanian majority population and the misrepresentation of their history and culture. Memories of first-hand experiences, photographs and artifacts, and some written records were passed down through private channels of families entrusted only to friends and are only now being recorded for posterity. Only in the middle of 2000s, we did the effort begin in an orchestrated way to reconstruct through oral history the essential role that Kosovo Albanians played in hiding Jews from the Nazis and securing their safe travel to Albania. Kosovo, illegally annexed by Serbia at the end of World War I, was conquered by the German Nazis in April 1941, along with the rest of Yugoslavia. After the Yugoslavia's capitulation to Hitler's forces, most of Kosovo, with its Albanian majority population, was reunited briefly with Albania, which had been under the control of the Italian fascists since April 1939. Cambridge University professor Noel Malcolm explained this development in his book Kosovo, A Short History. I quote, "At the meeting of the Italian and German foreign ministers in Vienna on April 21, it was agreed that the largest part of this Albanian inhabited territory, Kosovo, should be put under Italian control and joined to Albania, in order to prevent Albanian ethnic irredentism from becoming the driving force of an anti-German resistance. Jews in Kosovo who had resided there since 15th century were in a great jeopardy, and their Kosovar Albanian rescuers acted on their behalf at enormous personal risk. Like Albanians inside the sovereign nation of Albania, Kosovars also acted out of the same moral code, BESA, in rescuing Jews during the World War II, that has sustained Albanians for thousands of years. At its core was the concept of BESA, requiring an uncompromising protection of those in need, and a long history of interreligious harmony. One of the first recorded rescues of Jews in Kosovo occurred in Pristina, the country's capital, when Serbian authorities complied with Nazi demands to jail 60 Jewish men and prepare them for transport to the extermination camp in Auschwitz, Poland. Spiro Lito, an Albanian doctor who worked at the hospital of Pristina, enlisted the city's mayor to support his Jews to save these men. He took all of the hospital physicians to visit the Jewish prisoners and then declared to the Nazis that the prisoners has contracted typhus, and to prevent a widespread epidemic had to be transported immediately to hospitals in Albania. The men were quickly dispatched to Berat, a city in Albania, where Albanian authorities gave them false documents to hide their Jewish identities and then sent them into safe hiding in rural Albanian villages. The issue of whether Kosovo Albanians collaborated with their Nazi occupiers has been the subject of much debate. Although some collaboration took place, as Noel Malcolm has explained, I quote him again, the driving force was neither ideological sympathy with fascism or Nazism, nor any interest in the wider war aims of the Axis power, but simply the desire of many Albanians to seize the opportunity offered by the collapse of Yugoslavia to gain more power over their own territory and reverse the colonizing and Slavicizing policies of the previous 2 decades. End of quote. For the same reason, some Kosovars were attracted to communism. The Yugoslav Communist Partisan under General Marshal Tito agreed at 2 conferences in Albania in 1944 to make Kosovo independent as soon as the Nazis were defeated. But they reneged their promises. After the Nazis withdrew, Tito would declare in 1945 the new political geography and constitution of Yugoslavia, which would place 5 republics and 2 provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina, under Serbia. The majority of Kosovar Albanians opposed Nazism, and many more than have been documented thus far acted to free Jews. My great-grandfather, Arslan Rezniqi, was one of the leading members of the Nazi resistance in Kosovo, who devoted 6 years of his life to saving Jews. My grandfather, Mustafa Rezniqi, an adolescent during the war, assisted him, and for the rest of his life he preserved and carried on the history of our family's role that of other Kosovar Albanians in rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. The narrative of Kosovar Albanian resistance to the Nazis actually begins with my great-grandfather Arslan Mustafa Rezniqi. He was a merchant in Jakova, in Kosovo, who later moved to live and work in the city of Dejan. As far back in 1931, he made a living as a trader in Albania, Macedonia, Turkey and Greece, and his principal colleagues were Jews from Skopje in Macedonia and from Thessaloniki, Greece. Chief among them were David Cohen and Rafael Natan. In 1939, on the eve of World War II, when their lives were clearly at risk with the rise of Nazism in Europe, David Cohen and Rafael Natan and another colleague of them, Solomon Conforti, reached out to my great-grandfather for help. They asked him to come and live with our family in Dejan, if we could provide them with accommodation and security. My great-grandfather brought Cohen, Natan, and Conforti and their families into his home in 1940. Later, after Yugoslavia capitulated to the Nazis in 1941, my great-grandfather continued to hide them and eventually helped them flee to Albania. My great-grandfather Arslan Rezniqi built a new stone house in our family garden in which we sheltered Jews that would come and ask for help. In early 1941, 3 members of the Rezniqi family died from an epidemic of typhus that broke out in Kosovo. My grandfather, Mustafa Rezniqi, was among those who contracted the disease. Coincidentally, that March, a Jewish physician, Haino Ravanel, was mobilized in Skopje, Macedonia, in a Yugoslav army unit. Traveling by train to Peja, a city in Kosovo, from which he was to continue on to Jakova by bus, Dr. Ravanel ran into Solomon Conforti, a person that was already sheltered at our family's house in Dejan. And Solomon Conforti was also a Jew from Skopje, same as Dr. Abravanel. Conforti immediately informed my great-grandfather about the presence of Dr. Abravanel in Kosovo and the prospect of his treating his son Mustafa. Conforti convinced Abravanel to accompany him to Dejan to treat my grandfather, who at that time was under the care of two Serb doctors who thought that he was suffering from malaria. When Dr. Abravanel arrived in Dejan, he quickly discovered that my grandfather had typhus and fortunately was able to save his life. Mustafa would go on to assist his father in rescue of Jews, would pass this family story to his son Adnan, which is my father, and to me. Later, when Dr. Abravanel and his army unit were captured by the German in Kosovo, my great-grandfather went looking for him, found him, and helped return him to safety in our family home in Dejan. During the 5 months that he spent there, Dr. Abravanel treated the local Albanian population and refused to take any recompense for his services, saying all the time that he lived and ate for free at home of Arslan Rezniqi, and therefore there was no need to pay him. In time, Dr. Abravanel wanted to return to his wife Berta and his family in Skopje, and my great-grandfather accompanied him to his return trip to Macedonia. As word spread about Rezniqi family sanctuary, other Jewish families approached our family for help, and soon 40 families from Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Serbia were sheltered in our house, sometimes for days, often for months, until my family was able to organize safe passage for them to Albania. To camouflage their presence, all of the Jewish families were given traditional Albanian clothes to wear. Also, some of them were provided with false documents registering them as Bosnians, as the Jews from Macedonia knew the Serbo-Croatian languages. With my great-grandfather connections at the mayor's office, that was a person, Arif Alichkai, and he provided the false documents registering Jews as Bosnians, and then they would not be in risk by the Nazis. The residents of Dejan knew that Arslan and his wife, my great-grandmother, Fatima Savileti Rezniqi, were harboring Jews, but none of them ever informed the Nazi police patrolling the area. According to Ibrahim Kadriu, a journalist in Kosovo, I quote him, "While the Nazis were looking everywhere for Jews and had already imprisoned 40 Jewish families in Mitrovica, a city in North Kosovo, 120 Jews in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, and 30 in Prizren, the largest city in South Kosovo, the Rezniqi house served as a safe shelter and transfer point for Jews. The transfer of these families to Albania was, as well as the Conforti, Natan, and Cohen families, all of which took place in 1943, was done by the help of my great-grandfather's Kosovo Albanian colleagues, Halim Spahiu, a merchant with contacts in the Albanian Chamber of Commerce in Tirana, and his partner Hasan Rema Zerta. Many of the Jewish families were also sent on to Italy with additional help of Pashuk Biba, that was also a merchant from Albania, and his brother Kolja was Albania's Minister of the Interior. My great-grandfather and his colleagues were able to use their trading routes and contacts in the Balkans to secure safe passage for hundreds of Jews. Dr. Abravanel survived the war working as a doctor in Manastir, the old city of Skopje in Macedonia, and my family kept in touch with him over the years. However, in the 1963, tragedy struck when Skopje was hit by an earthquake, killing the doctor's daughter Reina and her husband, Dr. Salvatore Lever. But Dr. Abravanel and his wife Berta went to live in Israel after the earthquake with their granddaughter Shirley, that today lives in Israel. And an interesting connection about this story during the World War II is with the Kosovo War in 1999, because during the war in Kosovo, the granddaughter, Dr. Abravanel, that today lives in Israel, she's Rachel Drummer today, sent information to the medias and also to Jewish Center in Macedonia asking where is the Rezniqi family that rescued during the Holocaust my grandfather, and I want now to help them. And the picture of our family will all the time during the war passing by to the camps, refugee camps in Macedonia, asking for where is the Rezniqi family. We contacted with the Jewish community in Macedonia, and we told them that we don't want to go to Israel because we are waiting for the war in Kosovo to end as fast as it can, and we to go back at our houses where we were living at, and we don't want to start a new life in another country. At the end of October 2007, my grandfather, Mustafa, traveled to Israel to attend the recognition at Yad Vashem of the saving role that Albanians had played during the Holocaust. In Jerusalem, he had an emotional reunion with Rachel, drummer, the granddaughter of Dr. Haim Abravanel, who had saved his life as a teenager during the war. He told me that as soon as he and Shirley met, they embraced. They could not hold back their tears. And they spent an evening sharing their memories about Haim and Berta. Shirley told my grandfather about their later years in Israel. 2 years earlier of that, in 2005, my grandfather and Jangulya Ilyazi co-founded the Dr. Haim Abravanel Kosovo-Israeli Friendship Association in Pristina. I'm the organization secretary. We have been able to identify at least 60 families in Kosovo that provided shelter and safe passages for Jews. On March 17, 2009, Yad Vashem recognized Arslan Rezniqi and his family for their saving role during the Holocaust, the first Kosovar Albanians to receive the award of Emeritus among the nations. Mustafa Rezniqi accepted the award in Kosovo's capital, in Pristina, and on behalf of his father. A year later of that, on May 28, Mustafa died at the age of 85. Before he died, Shirley Cloyes, DioGuardi, and I created and produced a videotaped interview with him, which we will now show the experts for. And we don't have time. Okay. It was an interview with him that we taped already, but there is no time to show it. But I would like to mention just a quote.
A couple of minutes. Oh, okay. No, I just want to be, respectful of your wanting to have a discussion with everyone in the panel. But if you'd like to see a little bit, it's worth it. I think I should add that we were in a difficult position. We have about 6.5 hours of raw footage based on questions, very extensive questions that I sent there, but I couldn't be there at the time, even though Mustafa and I knew each other well, and I had spoken with him at length the summer before. Those were overdubbed in English. I reduced some of this to about 15 minutes, but there's a lot more work that has to be done on even those 15 minutes for a setting of this kind, so I hope you will be appreciative of that reality, and will eventually work on this in a much more systematic way and produce something that will make more sense actually within an oral history context, because the life story of the Rezniqi family is as important as the story we've just tried to present. Do you want to?
Yes, but I just want to mention a quote that all the time my grandfather said to me, that is, no matter what the risk is to you and your family, you may never betray your promised word, which is Besa.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Exactly. And that's it for us too.
Is this an edited film?
Well, yes, because it's
So it's not a real life story?
No, it's the edited version of, this is a direct interview. You'll see Leka interviewing his grandfather.
But it's edited.
But cold down, yes,
I'm
cold
not
down,
criticizing.
yeah.
I just
No,
don't know what
it is verbatim, but cold down to 15 minutes of the larger piece.
And I am here with my grandfather, Mustafa Rezniqi, co-chair of the Kosovo-Israel Friendship Association, to record a live history interview. This is part of a project that we're doing in conjunction with the Albanian American Foundation, directed by Shirley Cloyes, to reveal the role that Kosovo Albanians played in saving Jews during the Holocaust. Today is 18th November of 2008, and we are here at my grandfather's place in Pristina. Shirley has provided a list of questions. She and I will edit your answers for publication. So, grandfather, do I have your permission to record this interview? Absolutely, yes. Did your parents have friendships with the Jewish families? Grandfather, please tell us the names of the Jews that your parents and your family had relationships, and with whom and with what you know about their lives. Yes, indeed, my family had a very good working relationship with the Jewish families. This is a partial list of the Jews that lived in the China family. And so the names of the people, the Goforti family, Cloyes family, the Natan family, the Zarka family, and the Abravanel family. And they were all kind of family related, and they saw our house as more secure. As you know, there's Jews being relatives to one another, and they would call other relatives that they could come to Dechun. And Dechun and our house was a transit point for these Jews that wanted to actually go into Albania. As you know, most of these Jews wanted to go into Albania because they knew they were safer there. I mean, we never had any major incidents. But you remember a couple of